The smell of spices and the elegance of the Black Diamond restaurant enveloped me. From the moment I crossed the threshold, my hands, sweaty, held my chef's case with a mix of nervousness and determination that I tried to hide. I am Maya Thompson, 28 years old, the first Black chef to step into this restaurant as part of the kitchen brigade. Every step I took resonated like a silent challenge against years of systematic exclusion. In the culinary world, the head chef, a man around 50 with an impeccably white apron, looked me up and down. His gaze was not welcoming, but an uncomfortable evaluation that made me feel out of place, as if I didn't belong in this space. "You're the new one?" he asked with a tone that dripped more doubt than curiosity. His eyes scanned my uniform as if looking for some defect. "Yes," I responded, keeping my voice firm. "Maya Thompson, chef specializing in southern coastal cuisine." Each word was an act of resistance. The other chefs watched me sideways. Some disguised their discomfort, others didn't bother to hide their contempt. I could feel the weight of their gazes, loaded with prejudices I knew well. The kitchen atmosphere was tense, a boiling pot of looks and uncomfortable silences. The equipment gleamed, the knives were perfectly sharpened. But racism hung in the air heavier than any pot. My training, my years of study, my achievements seemed to dissolve in that moment. I wasn't a chef. I was an intruder in a territory that had historically been denied to me. The murmurs began. Whispered phrases, half smiles, sit-along glances. I didn't need to hear them to know what they were saying. The color of my skin was my first letter of introduction. Long before my culinary skills, the head chef finally spoke. "We'll see what you can do." His tone was more a challenge than a welcome. At that moment, while holding my chef's knife and feeling my colleagues' gazes, I wondered, will I survive my first day in this place that already judged me before I even began? My workstation was the smallest, located in a corner far from the central kitchen. Every movement I made seemed to be observed with an invisible magnifying glass, each cut, each preparation subjected to relentless scrutiny. Marcus, the sous chef, constantly passed by checking my work. His comments were not instructive, they were deliberately cutting. "That cut is not adequate," he said while reviewing my vegetables. "In this restaurant, we work with precision." His words resonated with more than culinary criticism. I felt the weight of a subtly poisoned discrimination, a rejection that manifested in every observation. The other chefs ignored me. When they needed something, they avoided addressing me directly. My requests for ingredients or utensils were answered with monosyllables, looks of annoyance. The service that night would be crucial. A group of food critics would visit the restaurant, and each dish would be evaluated with absolute precision. My specialty, a coastal ceviche with innovative techniques, had been almost vetoed by the head chef. "Too experimental," he had said. "Here we follow tradition." But I knew my dish was more than a recipe. It was a declaration of identity, a way of making visible the cuisine of my region, of my people. As the service began, I felt that every movement was a battle. My hands, though nervous, were precise. Each ingredient was treated with the respect of someone who knows its history. The critics were approaching. I could feel the tension in the kitchen increasing with each minute. While finishing my ceviche, I wondered, would this be the moment I prove I deserve to be here? Or the instant I'd confirm all their prejudices? The food critics occupied the main table. Their expensive suits, calculated gestures, seemed designed to intimidate. I could hear their conversations between the kitchen and the dining room, fragments of discussions that revealed a world of privileges. Marcus continued monitoring each of my movements. His gaze was sharper than the professional knives distributed. In the kitchen, I felt that each of my preparations was viewed as a potential threat. "The ceviche won't work," he muttered to the head chef. "It's too different." But I had already prepared the dish. My hands, hardened by years of practice, knew every detail of the family recipe my grandmother taught me in New Orleans. It wasn't just food, it was memory. The first dishes began to come out. Every movement in the kitchen was a tense dance of precision and fear. The critics tasted with analytical, almost surgical looks. A murmur began to circulate. The critics commented to each other, their expressions subtly changing with each bite. "Who prepared this ceviche?" one of them asked, raising his voice enough for the entire kitchen to hear. The silence was immediate. All eyes turned towards me. Marcus tried to intervene. "It's an experimental dish from the new chef," he said, his tone suggesting that experimental was synonymous with inferior. But the critic insisted. His plate was half empty, not out of contempt, but from absolute concentration on the flavors. "No," he said, "this dish is not just experimental, it's extraordinary." In that moment of absolute silence, with all eyes on me, I wondered, would this be my moment to break all barriers, or just another mirage of recognition? The silence in the kitchen was denser than any reduced sauce. The food critics continued tasting, and each bite seemed to dismantle the invisible barriers that had been constructed around me. "This ceviche," said one of them, a man around 50 with thick glasses, "is not just a dish. It's a cultural statement." Marcus tried to intervene, but was abruptly interrupted. The tension was palpable, cutting through the air like a professional knife. The head chef approached, his face a mask of discomfort. I could see the panic in his eyes. Something was slipping out of his control. "Who is the chef who prepared this dish?" the lead critic insisted. I stepped forward, feeling that each step was a declaration. My hands, stained with the colors of the ingredients, were slightly trembling. "It's me," I responded. "Maya Thompson, chef of Southern Coastal Cuisine." The critic's eye steadied me. It wasn't a look of culinary evaluation, it was something deeper. They perceived that my dish was more than food. It was resistance. Marcus muttered something under his breath, a comment that sounded like contempt. But no one paid him any attention. "This dish," the critic continued, "challenges all traditional narratives of Southern cuisine. It's not an adaptation, it's a rewriting." The entire kitchen was watching me, some with hate, others with a mixture of surprise and respect. In that moment, I understood that my battle was not just for culinary recognition. It was a challenge to entire structures of power and representation. While the critics continued tasting, I wondered, would this moment be the beginning of my true transformation? Or just another mirage of recognition? The restaurant seemed frozen in a moment of absolute tension. The critics remained at their table. My ceviche, a silent protagonist in a battle that transcended the culinary world. "This is not just a dish," declared the lead critic, "it's a story." His words resonated like a hammer blow in the kitchen. Marcus, the sous chef, visibly tensed. Something in his expression made me intuit that there was more behind his constant hostility. The head chef began to sweat, his movements became nervous, calculating. I could feel that something was crumbling beyond my expectations. "Tell us about this dish," one of the critics challenged me. His gaze was penetrating. As if searching for something more than ingredients, I began to narrate. I spoke to them about my grandmother in New Orleans, about the traditional recipes of the Southern Coastal region, how each ingredient tells a story of resistance and survival. Marcus interrupted. "Not everything is as romantic as it seems." His comment sounded more like a warning than a culinary critique. The critics exchanged meaningful glances. "What do you mean?" asked the lead critic. A dense silence fell over the kitchen. I could hear the beating of my own heart, mixed with the whistling of pots and the distant murmur of diners. Marcus took a step forward. His posture had changed. He was no longer the contemptuous supervisor, but someone about to reveal something important. "This recipe," he said, pointing at me, "is not entirely yours." At that moment, with all eyes on me, I wondered what secret was about to be revealed that could change everything I thought I knew about my own work. Marcus's declaration cut through the air like a sharp knife. The critics looked at each other, and I felt my heart beating with a mix of fear and curiosity. "What do you mean?" I asked, maintaining a calm that moments ago no longer existed. The head chef intervened, his face paler than the white apron. "Marcus, shut up," he muttered, but was ignored. "This recipe," Marcus said, pointing at me, "was stolen from the restaurant's original archives, a recipe that belonged to the founding family." A murmur ran through the kitchen. The critics leaned in, attentive to every word. I felt the ground moving beneath my feet. "My grandmother taught me," I responded, my voice firm but with an internal tremor. "It comes from generations of women from the Southern Coastal region." Marcus pulled out an old recipe book. Its yellowed pages seemed to hold ancient secrets. The head chef tried to intercept it, but it was too late. "Look," Marcus said, showing a page. "Here is the original recipe, signed by Eleanor Rodriguez in 1952. The critics examined the document. Their expressions changed like a slow-motion film. I felt my world crumbling. "Eleanor Rodriguez," one of them murmured. "The first black chef who worked in this restaurant. She was unfairly fired." A sepulchral silence fell over the kitchen. I understood that this was not just about a dish, but about a story of racism and invisibilization. The head chef tried to speak but was interrupted. The critics looked at him like an accused. The silence in the kitchen was deafening. The critics held the recipe book as if it were a judicial exhibit. The head chef began to sweat, his hands visibly trembling. "Eleanor Rodriguez," repeated one of the critics, "was fired in 1952 after creating this recipe. A black chef who never received recognition." Marcus looked at me with a mix of triumph and something that seemed like respect. I felt my personal story intertwining with a collective memory of pain and resistance. "Explain yourself," demanded the lead critic to the head chef. His voice sounded like a hammer of justice. The head chef stammered. We didn't know. The recipe was archived." But no one believed him. The documents were there in black and white, revealing decades of silencing and institutional racism. "My grandmother told me stories," I said, my voice firmly cutting through the tension. Stories of black women who cooked in the shadows, whose names were never written, the critics began to ask. Questions, each word uncovered layers of structural racism that went beyond a simple restaurant. The atmosphere was a mixture of disbelief, rage, and a strange feeling of truth finally coming to light. Marcus looked at me differently. He was no longer the hostile supervisor, but someone who seemed to have been an involuntary part of a system that needed to be dismantled. I want the truth, demanded one of the critics. Everything that happened with Elena Rodriguez. The head chef lowered his gaze. He was defeated, trapped between documents that revealed decades of injustice. The other chefs looked at me, some with shame, others with a newly discovered respect. In the midst of the storm of revelations, I wondered, was this the moment of justice that so many generations had waited for? Or just another chapter in the long history of invisibility? The silence broke when the lead critic fully opened the recipe book. Its pages revealed more than a simple culinary history. They were a testimony of institutional racism. Elena Rodriguez, he began to read aloud, extraordinary chef, unfairly fired in 1952 for being considered inappropriate to represent the restaurant's image. The words floated in the air like daggers. The head chef seemed to shrink with each line read. I had the testimony of her granddaughter, said another critic, pulling out a document. Elena was not only fired, she was completely erased from the restaurant's history. I felt my personal story intertwining with this collective memory of pain. My ceviche was no longer just a dish. It was a testimony of resistance. Marcus, surprisingly, stepped forward. I worked here for 20 years, he declared. I knew something wasn't right, but I never dared to speak up. The critics began an interrogation. Each question uncovered layers of deeply rooted systemic racism in the institution. How many black chefs were silenced? One of them asked. The head chef couldn't respond. His silence was more revealing than any words. My grandmother told me stories, I intervened. Stories of women who cooked in the shadows, whose names were never written. The documents showed a pattern. Every time a black chef stood out, she was immediately marginalized, her recipe stolen, her talent denied. This restaurant is not just a place to eat, said the lead critic. It's a symbol of a system that has systematically denied black chefs talent. The entire kitchen seemed like a courtroom. Every chef, every worker, was now a witness to a truth that had been silenced for decades. In the midst of the storm of revelations, I wondered, would this be the moment to definitively break the silence? Or just another chapter in our long history of resistance? The restaurant had transformed into a boiling pot of tensions. The food critics exchanged looks loaded with meaning, while the head chef seemed on the verge of a nervous breakdown. This goes beyond a simple case of culinary plagiarism, declared the lead critic. His voice resonated with an authority that made the restaurant walls tremble. Marcus, surprisingly, became our unexpected ally. I can testify, he said, about years of discriminatory practices in this kitchen. The documents on the table were a silent accusation. Decades of erased stories, denied talents, stolen recipes. Elena Rodriguez, I continued, was not just a chef. She was a culinary artist whose legacy was deliberately hidden. A murmur ran through the kitchen. The cooks who had previously looked at me with contempt now kept an uncomfortable silence. The head chef tried to speak but was interrupted. His power crumbled like a poorly prepared sofa. We have proof, said one of the critics, showing a series of old documents. Proof of how chefs of color have been systematically denied recognition in this restaurant. My ceviche, which had initiated everything, was now more than a dish. It was a declaration, a testimony, a living memory. The critics began to ask questions. Each response uncovered another layer of institutional racism. The kitchen had become an improvised court where truth was the only judge. It's not just about a recipe, I said, my voice firmly cutting through the tense air. It's about decades of invisibility, of denied talents, of erased stories. I could feel Elena Rodriguez's gaze, the forgotten chef holding me from somewhere between memory and justice. In the midst of this tsunami of revelations, I wondered, would this be the moment to definitively break the silence? Or simply another chapter in our long struggle to be recognized? The restaurant had ceased to be a gastronomic space and had become a stage of historical justice. The critics were exchanging documents, pointing at paragraphs. While the atmosphere grew increasingly dense, we have exhaustively reviewed the archives, began the lead critic. His voice sounded like an unappealable verdict. The head chef was pale, his hands visibly trembling. Marcus, who was once his right-hand man, now looked at him with a mixture of contempt and disappointment. The evidence is overwhelming, continued another critic. A systematic pattern of racial discrimination that spans decades. The documents showed one file after another. Each page revealed a story of silence, black talents, stolen recipes, truncated dreams. Elena Rodriguez was not an isolated case, I declared. She was the first of many voices deliberately silenced. A sepulchral silence fell over the kitchen. The cooks who had previously looked at me with contempt now lowered their eyes. Unable to bear the weight of the truth, the head chef tried to speak but was interrupted. His power crumbled like a poorly prepared sauce. This is not just about recognition, I said. My voice firmly cutting through the tense air. It's about justice, visibility. About recovering a history that was stolen from us. The critics began to discuss among themselves. Each document was another piece of an institutional racism puzzle now being publicly exposed. My ceviche, which had initiated everything, was now more than a dish. It was a declaration, a testimony, a living memory of resistance. I could feel the presence of Elena Rodriguez, of my grandmother, of all the black women who had cooked in the shadows, supporting me in this crucial moment, *, in the midst of this storm of revelations with all eyes on me. I wondered, would this be the moment to definitively break the chains of silence? Or simply another chapter in our long struggle to be recognized? The silence was so dense it could be cut with a chef's knife. The food critics had laid out a series of documents revealing a pattern of institutional racism, deeper than anyone had imagined. This is not just a case of plagiarism, declared the lead critic. It's an entire system of cultural oppression. Each document uncovered another layer of discrimination. Names of black chefs, their recipes, their stories, had been systematically erased from the restaurant's history. Marcus, surprisingly, became the most unexpected ally. I worked here for 20 years, he began. I always knew something wasn't right, but I had never dared to speak up. His words resonated like a confession. The head chef looked at him with a mixture of betrayal and fear. We have proof of how archives were manipulated, continued one of the critics. Altered documents, eliminated names, denied talents. My ceviche, which had initiated everything, was now the symbol of a resistance larger than any dish. My grandmother told me stories. I intervened, stories of women who cooked in the shadows, whose names were never written. The documents showed a chilling pattern. Every time a black chef stood out, they were immediately marginalized, their recipe stolen, their talent denied. This goes beyond gastronomy, said another critic. It's a testimony of structural racism. The kitchen had transformed into an improvised court. Every chef, every worker was a witness to a truth that had been silenced for decades. The head chef tried to defend himself, but his arguments sounded hollow, weak against the overwhelming evidence. It's not just about recognition, I said, my voice firmly cutting through the tense air. It's about reclaiming our history, our dignity, * in the midst of this storm of revelations. With all eyes on me, I wondered, would this be the moment to definitively break the chains of silence? Or simply another chapter in our long struggle to be recognized? The kitchen was a boiling pot of contained emotions. The food critics had transformed the restaurant into a tribunal of historical justice. Each document, each testimony, was a piece of a racial oppression puzzle now being publicly exposed. Documentation is not enough, declared the lead critic. We need action. I looked at my ceviche, which was no longer just a dish, but a symbol of resistance. Each ingredient seemed to tell a story of survival, of ancestral memory. Marcus approached me. I should never have stayed silent for so long, he murmured. His voice sounded like a collective apology. The head chef was defeated. His empire of silence and discrimination was crumbling before his own eyes. We're going to do something that has never been done before, announced one of the critics. We're going to rewrite the history of this restaurant. A plan began to take shape. It wasn't just about recognition, but about radical transformation. We propose, continued the critic, creating a mentorship program for black chefs recovering forgotten names, documenting our true culinary history. I felt something larger than myself was happening. It wasn't just about my ceviche. It was about decades of silence, voices finally finding their place. My grandmother, Elena Rodriguez, all the forgotten cooks seemed present in that moment. Their spirits supported us, inspired us. This restaurant, I declared, will no longer be a place of oppression, but of memory and justice. The cooks looked at me, some with respect, others with a mixture of shame and hope. Marcus took my hand, a gesture of alliance that transcended any previous hierarchy. * In that moment, with the kitchen as a witness to our transformation, I wondered, would this be the beginning of a new story or just another mirage of change? The Black Diamond restaurant was no longer the same. What began as a simple workday had transformed into a movement of culinary and racial justice. The critics had developed a comprehensive historical reparation plan. It wasn't just about recognizing Elena Rodriguez, my grandmother, and so many other invisible black chefs, but about creating a real system of opportunities. We're going to create a mentorship program, declared the lead critic, a fund to support Afro-descendant chefs, scholarships, training spaces. Marcus, who was previously part of the oppression system, had now become a crucial ally. His internal testimonies had been critical in dismantling years of institutional racism. My ceviche, which had initiated everything, was now more than a dish. It was a symbol of resistance, of ancestral memory, of the struggle for recognition. This is not just about food, I said, looking at everyone. It's about reclaiming our dignity, our history. The chefs looked at me differently. I was no longer the newcomer, the stranger. I was the one who had triggered a radical transformation. The head chef, defeated, signed documents that obligated him to create spaces of real inclusion in the kitchen. We want this to serve as inspiration, continued the critic, to demonstrate that talent has no color, that the kitchen is a space of encounter and transformation. I felt my grandmother and Elena Rodriguez accompanying me in that moment. Their spirits were present in every ingredient, in every movement. Looking directly at the camera, with the entire kitchen as a witness, I decided to make a direct call. And now I ask you, who are watching this story, have you ever experienced racism in your work, in your school, in your daily life? Share your experience. Use the hashtags #MyRacistInStory, #racism never again on your social media. Every story counts. Every voice matters. Together we can transform reality. * in this moment of revelation and hope, I wondered, would this be the beginning of a true revolution or just another chapter in our long struggle for justice?